What's going on, you guys? It's Rahul here, and today we're creating an all-time starting five for every NBA team. Obviously, every NBA team has had some great players in their franchise's history, and we're going to create a team consisting of those best players. With that being said, let's get started. But before we get started, let's make sure you like and subscribe as always, as it really helps the channel and so you don't miss out on any video. And also, let's lay out the one rule we have. The one rule we really just have is the fact that a player cannot represent more than two teams. So Tracy McGrady can represent either Orlando or Houston, for example, but he cannot represent both teams. With that being said, let's get started. With the Boston Celtics, whose lineup consists of Bob Cousy, John Havlicek, Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Bill Russell. Obviously, the Celtics are an amazing franchise. We've had many great players and are the most successful, as they have the most championships in NBA history with 17. So we had to leave out guys like Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, and Ray Allen, but it's still an amazing team. I mean, seriously, they're great on offense and defense. I can't name a single guy on this team who's a bad defender. Or Larry Bird, even though he's probably the worst defender on this team, was still pretty solid, as he did make some all defensive teams. With that being said, not much has to be said for this Boston Celtics team besides it's amazing. Whatever. Anyways, moving on to the Philadelphia 76ers. Their lineup consists of Maurice Cheeks, Allen Iverson, Julius Erving, Charles Barkley, and Moses Malone. Now, we couldn't use Wilt Chamberlain since, spoiler, he's going to be on another team. Comment it down below if you guys know. Whatever. Anyways, Moses Malone is still going to be a really good replacement for Wilt Chamberlain since he's one of the most underrated players of all time. He's a great rebounder, scorer, and can also defend the paint. Charles Barkley was a good rebounder too and a good scorer and really blossomed into a star in Philadelphia. Maurice Cheeks, Julius Erving, and Moses Malone were all part of the championship team. We're all part of a really good Philadelphia 76ers team they had in the 80s. Allen Iverson was amazing in his time in Philadelphia. It's just he didn't have any other stars. Then Charles Barkley did play for the 76ers, and they were an amazing team. So adding Allen Iverson to this team is just going to make this team really good. And yeah, this team is just very good. Not much else has to be really said since they're a really, really well-balanced team. Next up, moving on to the Brooklyn Nets, who aren't the most storied franchise, but regardless, their lineup consists of Jason Kidd, Otis Birdsong, Richard Jefferson, Buck Williams, and Brook Lopez. Jason Kidd and Richard Jefferson all played together. Buck Williams was really good and probably their second best player in franchise history. Brook Lopez was at his peak in Brooklyn, and Otis Birdsong had some really good years in Brooklyn. And because of that, I do think this lineup's all right. And, I mean, not much has to be said. So, with that being said, let's move on to the New York Knicks, whose starting five consists of Walt Frazier, Allen Houston, Bernard King, Willis Reed, and Patrick Ewing. Walt Frazier is one of the best perimeter defenders of all time. Allen Houston's a good scorer. Bernard King was really good for the Knicks in the 80s. Willis Reed was a crucial part of their 70s championship teams. Then Patrick Ewing, as we all know, led them to a lot of success in the 90s. This team really isn't too bad, despite the New York Knicks being a laughingstock for quite a while now. Anyways, with that being said, still a good team. Let's move on to the Toronto Raptors, who aren't the most storied franchises, as they've been around for only 24 years. With that being said, though, their starting five consists of Kyle Lowry, Vince Carter, Kawhi Leonard, Chris Bosh, and Jonas Valanciunas. This team would give some modern NBA teams a lot of trouble. Obviously, Jonas Valanciunas, I don't hate the guy, but he's easily the weak spot on this roster, as he was never really an all-star or even considered to be one. But that being said, basically every position on this team is still really good, as a lot of these guys, they got some good offense and they got some good defense. With that being said, let's move on with the Miami Heat, as they really do get screwed up by the rule that players can't represent two or more teams. Well, they can't represent two teams. I think you guys see the point. However, this is still a really good lineup, as they got Tim Hardaway, Dwayne Wade, Glenn Rice, Udonis Haslem, and Alonzo Mourning. Dwayne Wade and Udonis Haslem were really good when they did play together. Tim Hardaway and Alonzo Mourning plus Glenn Rice were also pretty good when they were in Miami together. So adding Udonis Haslem and Dwayne Wade was really good. But I do have to admit, if I did take away the one rule that we do have about players being on more than one team, I do think this team would be much better. But with that being said, this Miami Heat team is still very good. And let's move on to the Charlotte Hornets, who aren't a very storied franchise either. However, they still have a nice lineup of Kemba Walker, Del Curry, Gerald Wallace, Larry Johnson, and Emeka Okafor. Emeka Okafor had his best years in Charlotte. Larry Johnson was really good in Charlotte. Gerald Wallace also had some of his best years in Charlotte. Del Curry was a really good three-point shooter and was part of their 90s teams. And Kemba Walker is arguably their best player in franchise history. If you ask me, man, that was weird. If you ask me, this team is still very good, as they do have some good three-point shooting, defense, and offense. So with that being said, not much else has to be said with the Hornets. Man, I have the virus. No, I'm kidding you guys. I don't have the virus. Don't worry. Next up, we got the Atlanta Hawks, whose lineups consist of not Penny Hardaway, Lenny Wilkins, Joe Johnson, Dominique Wilkins, Bob Pettit, and Dikembe Mutombo. This lineup is still really good, as Lenny Wilkins is pretty solid. Joe Johnson has had his best years in Atlanta. Dominique Wilkins was also very good in Atlanta. Bob Pettit was really good in Atlanta too, and Dikembe Mutombo. Well, all of these guys were good in Atlanta. However, Dominique Wilkins never really had any other stars, and neither did Joe Johnson really. But adding all of these guys would make this team much better than the ones they had. And if you ask me, this team is still pretty decent, but definitely not the best on here. Not much else has to be said. Let's move on to the Orlando Magic, as their lineup consists of Jameer Nelson, Penny Hardaway, Nick Anderson, Horace Grant, and Dwight Howard. Obviously, this team definitely isn't as bad as you guys might think. I mean, prime Dwight Howard has been turned into one of the most underrated players ever, as before the whole injuries and the whole drama screwed his career up. In Orlando, he was amazing, as he was an amazing defensive player and was a good role man. So he was just one of the best bigs we've ever seen since Shaquille O'Neal. Penny Hardaway was also really good. Nick Anderson was pretty decent. Horace Grant had his best years in Orlando, and Jameer Nelson was part of those late 2000s teams that the Orlando Magic had. Not much else I have to say for the Orlando Magic. Let's move on to the Washington Wizards, whose lineup consists of John Wall, Gilbert Arenas, Caron Butler, Elvin Hayes, and Wes Unseld. John Wall's only star he really ever played with was Bradley Beal, and Gilbert Arenas definitely didn't have the greatest team, but we saw Gilbert Arenas and Caron Butler play together. And if you added John Wall, Elvin Hayes, and Wes Unseld on this team, RIP to Wes Unseld, FYI. Oh yeah, well, not FYI, but by the way. Anyways, moving on from that, this team is still alright. I mean, Wes Unseld and Elvin Hayes are easily their best players in franchise history. John Wall is also really good, and Caron Butler was a two-time All-Star in Washington, and Gilbert Arenas was an amazing scorer before he just fell off. With that being said, I don't have much else to say about Washington. Moving on to Milwaukee, their lineup consists of Sidney Moncrief, Ray Allen, Michael Redd, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Imagine having to guard Giannis and Kareem. My God, I can only imagine what that would be like. That would be one of the most hardest tasks ever. I mean, Giannis in the real NBA, this team would not be an absolute super team. I mean, if you replace Brook Lopez with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, they'd obviously get better, but this really dominant front court alone could lead them to a lot of wins. Michael Redd and Ray Allen on the perimeter would be deadly too, and then Sidney Moncrief's defense is really good. So overall, it's a pretty good lineup, and it's probably one of the best so far. Next up, we got Detroit, whose lineup consists of Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, Grant Hill, Bob Lanier, and Bill Laimbeer. This bad boys Pistons team was very good. Add it with Bob Lanier and prime Grant Hill before he got injuries really just screwing him up, this team would be amazing. I mean, Isaiah Thomas can score, dribble, pass, and defend. Joe Dumars can pass, shoot, and score and all. Grant Hill was amazing as a scorer. Bob Lanier was also really good. And then Bill Laimbeer was one of the very, very few centers in the league in the 80s who could actually make a three occasionally, as he was a blueprint for what is now the stretch big, and could also rebound and could also defend. But he is dirty. Anyways, with that being said, even if you hate the Bad Boys Pistons team, this team is very good. Moving on, we got the Cleveland Cavaliers, whose lineup consists of Mark Price, Kyrie Irving, LeBron James, Larry Nance, and Brad Daugherty. Mark Price and Brad Daugherty were a very good duo, and so was Larry Nance a good compliment. Larry Nance was a good compliment to them. LeBron James and Kyrie Irving, if you had them with Mark Price, Brad Daugherty, and Larry Nance, that would be a very good lineup, as LeBron James is amazing. Well, he's LeBron. Kyrie Irving can handle the ball, and he can score and shoot. Mark Price was a good passer. He was a pretty decent defender, and he could also shoot and score the ball. Brad Daugherty was a great role man, and Larry Nance was also pretty good. Next, moving on, we got the Chicago Bulls, who have an amazing lineup consisting of Derrick Rose, Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, and Artis Gilmore. Add basically the big three from their 90s teams, but with a 7'2" Artis Gilmore, who was a good rebounder and a scorer, with a prime Derrick Rose. People who have to defend the paint, get ready to go up against that. That would be absolutely just amazing. It would be very hard to go against this team. This team would definitely go 80. I would not be surprised at all if they went 82-0 in the real NBA. And I don't have anything else to say about this one. Next up, moving on to the Indiana Pacers. I think their lineup consists of Mark Jackson, Reggie Miller, Paul George, Jermaine O'Neal, and Rick Smits. Rick Smits, Jermaine O'Neal, Mark Jackson, and Reggie Miller were all part of some of their pretty good 90s teams. And then Paul George was really good and didn't really have any other stars in his time in Indiana. But add these guys, and I think they got a pretty good team, but they definitely aren't as good as their Central Division partners. With that being said, you guys, that's going to wrap up part 1 of this video. Make sure you guys like the video if you guys did enjoy, and subscribe so you don't miss any content. And with that being said, I'm out, you guys.